Okay.
There we go.
So how many of you went to the conference? Did anybody here go? We had a wonderful time. We got to see lots of old friends, made some new friends. We got to present 5 times at the conference. So we were kind of busy little bees back and forth and all around. We were having a ball. And I think a couple of comments that came out of the presentation that we did on Friday, one of the gentlemen, he said, you know, I've never heard resilience presented like this before. He said, without resilience, none of this works. And I was like, wow, that was a kind of interesting comment, that he was noticing that a lot of the modalities and things that we use require us to have the ability to have insight into our own healing. So I thought that was really interesting that he said that. And then the other one was on Saturday morning, we were talking about the next level of nurse certification. And there was a pretty good discussion at the end of the presentation about what nurse coaching is going to look like in the future. And some of the things on the horizon as far as practicing at the top of our license as nurses when we're practicing nurse coaching. And I thought that was a really big distinction, because I guess there's some people out there that are saying that they're not going to practice under their nursing license. If you renew your license, you are a nurse, and you are a nurse when you are coaching. And I think that was a really good distinction for people. What else did you hear, Lynn?
Well, basically, some attorneys actually have said not to advertise the fact that you're a nurse when you are coaching. And that's exactly the opposite of the way that the holistic nurses are looking at nurse coaching. In other words, we're practicing at the top of our license as nurse coaches. And anyone who works with us as their client needs to know that we are a nurse. And it's going to be something that will be even more important legally in the future. But Margaret Erickson was is very clear about that you're a nurse first, and that's your primary identity, even while you are coaching. There are no exceptions.
Well, I liked when she said that, you know, when someone is getting a nurse as a coach, they're getting all of the knowledge that a nurse has. And I don't know, the way that she said that, I wish I could remember the exact words, but it really struck me like increasing that value that we have as nurses with the knowledge that we have. You know, someone might be talking to us and saying, you know, just in passing, you know, I have this sore on my toe, and then, you know, 10 minutes later says something about being diabetic. Other people wouldn't put 2 and 2 together, but a nurse does, because that's the way we listen to our patients for the things that they're not telling us. And that becomes part of the coaching that we do for people. So everyone, this is Lynn McCray. She is the chapter leader of the American Holistic Nurses Central Texas chapter. She's also the owner and founder of Advancing Nurse Coaching program. And she's been a nurse for 40 years.
At least.
She was a pioneer in her day. She actually opened a private practice in 1987, I think, in California. And she did stress management and prevention back then. And now we've come full circle talking about principles as reducing stress and helping people heal. And so we're going to hear a little bit about that tonight.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. Well, and as you all may know, Teresa is our co-leader of our chapter, so we work together. So the revolution in nursing and coaching begins. And what is that beginning, really? It's actually a new paradigm, a fresh paradigm, something that has always existed, but that we are only just now being able to give voice to in very simple, very easy lay terms, so that all of us can understand, all of our clients, all of our colleagues, all of our institutions and agencies, so that we can have a terminology that is easily understood, not complicated, but very, very simple, and that really explains how life works. So it has been a long time ago that Dr. William James, who was the father of American psychology, wrote his first book. In fact, I think it was about 1890. So I did the math, and that's been some 132 years ago. He titled his first book, The Principles of Psychology. But it's very interesting what he said about that. His colleagues said, well, we read your book, Dr. James, but what are the principles? And he had to tell them that they had not yet been revealed. So here is the wording that he used. The truth is that psychology is yet seeking her first principles and is in the condition of physics before Galileo or Newton. 1890. So this fact was actually the original vision of psychology in the late 1800s. But only because the principles were as yet not uncovered, they were unseen. This original vision was eventually lost. And what came to us much later on in the 1950s with Skinner at the University of Minnesota was behavior. And behavior comes after the fact. So the first principles were not known. And then in our own field, our own profession of nursing, Dr. Helen Erickson, one of our favorite holistic nursing theorists, and now residing here in Texas, wrote that we have yet to hypothesize, test, and formulate scientific principles of health and healthcare that so naturally fall within the professional nursing's range of concern. So that was 40 years ago. So in that time between 132 years ago and 40 years ago, it seemed as though those principles were known to exist and yet had not been located, articulated. So what kind of a state was psychology in before principles? Well, it really was more of a natural science. And as such, it is fragile and without principles. Human behavior was not understood. That's where Skinner and the behavioralists came in. They could train dogs to respond to bells and so forth. And that was considered a very important advancement, which it was at the time, and in understanding human behavior. But what still was missing is what we're talking about here tonight, which will be seen as the principles of psychology. So when the Skinner and the behavioralists were looking at human behavior, they were actually thinking about our mental life in a way that it never worked. So now we'll talk about how our mental life does work, and a way to begin that discussion is simply to explain what a paradigm is. Remember, we said in the beginning that the revolution in nursing and coaching begins a fresh paradigm. Well, in science and in philosophy, a paradigm is a distinct set of concepts or thought patterns, including theories, research methods, postulates, and standards for what constitutes legitimate contributions to a field. I think that that is a very good summary of what a paradigm is. And it has to have agreement on the part of the knowledgeable community that those are accepted concepts and thought patterns. And so one thing I want to point out here is that it includes theories. So a paradigm is an overarching entity, I guess we could call it, that includes all theories. So when we're talking about the fresh new paradigm, which has always existed, we are actually including all theories. And more specifically tonight, we're thinking of all nursing theories. And there are a lot of them, but they have commonalities that can be identified. And when we're looking at the principles, we see the principles in every theory. And the principles explain wholes that hadn't previously been explainable in other theories. So here we go, the resilience principles. And there are just three. They're single words, very, very simple, but we'll unpack this a little later. For now, though, we'll just give voice to these words individually. And as you see, here is a beautiful family holding hands, looking at a gorgeous sunset. And we know that what is missing in the world today is peace and happiness. And when we each find that for ourselves, we will have peace in the world. So the words that we're going to be using to talk about these principles are the word mind, the word consciousness, and the word thought. Now, all three of those words are familiar to us as nurses, and yet we're going to speak about them in a little bit different way. And we will talk about how they are all connected and, in fact, can not be separated. So these are, in fact, the first principles within what we are now beginning to call the single paradigm. This is the overarching paradigm that includes all theories, all nursing theories, all psychological theories, all theories will be understood to be contained within the single paradigm. So we've often heard talk about a unitary science. And even though we've been talking about it for decades, it has not really appeared until now. And that is because the principles represent a new development, which has always existed, but we're really giving voice to today in a new way. So a unitary science is science that is applicable to all sciences, whether it's physics, chemistry, the science of biology. All scientists are represented with the principles as a unitary science. So we've been talking about it for decades, and it is finally here. So the first principles are without limitations. They literally have no boundaries. So we see here in the beautiful image that Teresa found for us, a gorgeous, gorgeous photograph from space looking at the United States and the world globe and beyond. So what we're talking about tonight, the principles have no limitations. There are no boundaries. All human knowledge of ourselves and our existence is organized under the first principles, which is the single paradigm. These principles are the elements that create a paradigm. So think about the periodic chart, for example. We've got, as nurses, we've become very familiar with magnesium, calcium, potassium, iodine. We've become familiar with iron. Those are elements that cannot be broken down any farther. And what we're talking about tonight are elements that cannot be broken down, that create a paradigm. They're not a theory, it's a much different order, an overarching order. They are pre-existing fundamental building blocks of our experience of life. And we'll talk more about our experience in a minute. I just want to say that you see the name Blevins there on the lower right, and he came to speak to our Holistic Nursing Conference in 2015 and brought the implications, not applications, of the principles to us at our regional Holistic Nursing Conference. And so these are further refinements of the work that he did with us in 2015. Well, I'm just going to stop for a minute, take a deep breath, and look at the words here. The principle of mind. Well, the principle of mind is the largest and the overarching principle for all of the others. They can't exist separately. They are all one thing. This is just a sweet reminder. When I first heard this, I thought, that is so dumb. But it really gives pause to consider when we say that mind is not brain. In other words, you can't hold it in your hands. It's not something that we can see, taste, feel, or touch. What the principle of mind is, however, is a power. It's the power of mental life. It's a power which is actually a gift that all of humanity is blessed with. And it's how we create the mental life that we experience. So as such, we're going to use another word, catalyst. When I talk about catalyst, I like to say about an example of glue. You can get a really strong glue at the hardware store, and you have to break apart the little film that's between the two parts and mix them together in order for the really strong glue to work. Well, that catalyst is the reality that we are now looking at. Mind is the catalyst of our reality as we see it now. Take another deep breath and just look at the word consciousness. Now, as nurses, we all know that the human state of awareness is described as consciousness. Here, we're going to go beyond the individual and actually look at more of a universal consciousness that includes individual human consciousness. Well, this is an interesting definition, and I am going to focus on that word neutral. Consciousness is a spiritual neutral power before human existence. So in our world of reality today, that consciousness that we know as universal consciousness already existed prior to mankind. Consciousness is the tangible capability of making us aware of life, allowing us to be aware of our thoughts. Well, how important is that we are aware of our thoughts? That's the most important thing. If we, as humankind, were not aware of our thoughts, we would not have an experience of life. Consciousness is one of the elements that is absolutely required. We can't exist without it. So again, just a deep breath and look at that word thought, called thought. And again here, we come up with the same word, neutral. And in this case, thought is a neutral power, the same as consciousness is a neutral power. It's actually a gift. It's a power and a gift. It's a gift that every human being is blessed with on the planet. Every human being has employed the principle of thought, no matter how functional their brain may be. Human beings and animals, all animate objects, animals do have the power of thought. I know I've often opened the door and invited my dog to go out, and it's pouring down rain, and I say, Sandy, do you want to go outside? And you can almost hear the wheels turning in her head. Not today. So we all have the power of thought. Now, what we're just beginning to understand is that thought creates feeling 100% of the time. And this, I'll go on to say that this is precisely how human beings are all alike. We all have the power of thought. So when we're talking about equity and inclusion, this is it. None of us exist without that power of thought. It's natural to us. It's our inherent birthright. It is a feeling of innate well-being that is natural to all of us. And now we're discovering that thought creates feelings. You know how so many people focus on their feelings, and if they're feeling bad, they dive into the feelings and try to figure out where those feelings are coming from and when they started and how long they've been there. Well, those ideas about how thought works are not benefiting us. What is benefiting us is simply knowing, understanding deeply through insight that thought creates feeling 100% of the time. We actually have a colleague who works in the country of Nepal, and they had some terrible earthquakes in Nepal. I think about 11 of them over a period of a number of days. And as things were not structurally very sound, the people were so afraid of what the next earthquake might be that they were sleeping outside. They were afraid to have a roof over their heads because they thought it might fall down on them. And one woman, our colleague, who was responsible actually for health promotion within the country, had seen a little book and didn't even buy it. She just saw it in the bookstore and looked at the back cover, and it said, "Thought creates feeling 100% of the time." And she didn't buy the book, but when the earthquakes began, she realized that that was true. And so her colleagues and she were working with the people in the community where all of the earthquakes were happening. And one of the things that the people kept wanting to hear about was that there's no other place to be. We often describe it as be here now, but it's also described as there is no other place to be. And what she realized as she was working with the people and as their homes were being destroyed night by night, that there was nothing that was different about this time. That in fact, she realized for herself personally that she was as safe as she had ever been. And she decided to remain in the country and continue her work with her public. She could have certainly gone elsewhere. She had the means to do that, but she chose to stay because she wanted to bring the message of that thought creates feeling 100% of the time, because she knew through insight that she was as safe as she had ever been. So this is where invisible thought creates visible feelings. Resilience principles paradigm. Well, we call it that. We also call it the single paradigm. We have different words for it. But the bottom line is there is just one paradigm, which includes all theories, all concepts, all models of how human life works and how we function as human beings. So these principles of mind, consciousness, and thought cannot be separated. If one's missing, there is no paradigm and no experience of life. I love this. Teresa created it, and I think it's really a perfect little diagram. So at the top, we've got mind, the source of all knowledge. Consciousness, the awareness that we think, includes our senses. So that's where we have, where we can identify that we see, touch, and smell and feel what we are experiencing in life on this planet. So then that brings us to thought. And in this case, it's not our private little individual thinking that we're talking about, but rather thought as a larger order. It's a thought, it is thought before it takes form. Some people describe what we talk about as being similar to cognitive behavior therapy, for example. But in fact, with CBT, they're looking at reframing thoughts. And that's already too late, because once you've thought a thought, you can't go back. The thought, in this case, mind, consciousness, and thought. Thought is the fact of thought, universal thought, before it takes form. And again, our 100% of feeling arises from thought is a true statement, which is quite literally just being understood. We've spent so much time going into our feelings to find answers, and answers are not there. Answers are not in feelings. They're two sides of the same coin. We have thought on one side of the coin and feeling on the other. They can't be separated. But thought explains feelings. So then Teresa put our experience. Thought taking form in the moment is our experience. So moving first from mind through consciousness and thought is how our experience is created moment to moment. And she describes it as the perfect paradigm. So nurses love formulas. They like to see 2 + 2. And so here we are, another way of looking at this in the simplest possible terms. So here we have the formula: mind plus consciousness plus thought. None of those can be separate. We speak about them, we separate them out to talk about them. Mind, consciousness, and thought equals reality. The reality that we see moment to moment in our lives on the planet. So what do the principles do for a paradigm? Why is this important? Why do nurses benefit from knowing about principles and about a paradigm that includes principles? Well, first of all, it rules out the false causes of feelings. We've often attributed feeling bad due to something in our environment, circumstances, or other people. We've often thought that we had to either fight or run away from bad feelings. And now we can stop and say, wow, I have a part in that. If feelings come from thought, and thought is my thought, then I have a part in creating that feeling that I'm feeling at any given moment in time. So principles are a neutral force. When we talk about mind, really, and consciousness and thought, they are the strongest forces in the universe. But having said that, nevertheless, they still are neutral. They cannot have a direction unless we choose a direction for them. We can use the principles in a beneficial way or in a not beneficial way. And as such, they're a fact and not a belief. So lots of people on the planet have beliefs which they live by and fight by and die by. But this is not that. These elements are facts and not beliefs. So principles eliminate confusion. A paradigm is a scientific term that honors logic. And one of the things that Teresa and I said when we were speaking at the AHNA conference is that we can now teach through logic that which can only be understood through insight. And insight is the goal of all coaching. So that is a perfect way to marriage teaching our logic, which is now what we're calling coaching. When we find the logic that is explainable, it rules out all other illogic. So when we find that which is logical, the illogical simply falls away. And without principles, we're just searching for causative agents. We'll come back to that. We're searching, saying, well, there must be something that's causing this problem. There must be something that is creating this situation. But it leads to a never-ending search for answers, which are right under our nose the entire time when we include our own thought, consciousness, and mind into the equation. So what we're talking about now is the subtractive nature of the principles. And in regard to that, I just love this picture. Teresa found it. It's so beautiful to me because it takes us back to our roots, back to nature, back to our true understanding of who we are and our place in the world. We know that our feelings are coming from our thinking. We stop wondering why things are the way they are. We know where our experience is coming from. We no longer blame others. We are left with secure, not fearful thought and feeling. Now just think about that in our profession. Think about, I almost don't even want to give voice to these issues that we're experiencing within our profession, and yet the easiest way to explain it is to use words such as violence, bullying, burnout. When we know where our feelings are coming from, which is from our thinking, we stop wondering why things are the way that they are. We know where our experience is coming from. We no longer blame others. We're left feeling secure. None of those issues that I mentioned just now will continue to be issues for us when we understand that we can simply release our challenged thoughts by knowing where our feelings are coming from. Well, here we are now, we're coming into nurse coaching. So why are principles useful to us? They're useful to us because they inform nurse coaching. A shift in the paradigm defines a fundamental change in how you see the world. I'm going to tell a little story that Teresa often shares about when the pandemic came to her hospital. There was, of course, not much information, very much a shortage of PPE, lots of disquiet. And Teresa's daughter works at the same hospital as she did in admitting day surgeries. So she was in touch with the public all day long, every day. And as frightening as it was to Teresa, it was even more frightening when Teresa thought about her daughter. And Teresa thought, well, it may be okay if I catch the virus, but it's not okay if my daughter does. I can't lose her. And the thoughts just kept spinning and spinning and spinning. She finally went for a drive, and a thought occurred to her. She had an insight to give Lynn a call. So she called me, and the first words out of my mouth were, Teresa, you are as safe as you've ever been. Nothing had happened. All of that fearful thinking was a story that had been made up. Nothing had happened. And Teresa says when she had that realization that that was true, that she is as safe as she's ever been, she suddenly could see that there was a bright moon and that there were people driving in their cars and out walking. And the fearfulness of the thoughts that had consumed her were allowed to drift away, because she knew that she was as safe as she had ever been. The principles fill in the gaps in other paradigms that until now have been difficult to explain. And thus it is with the theories as well. There are gaps in all of the nursing theories. I'll just use that as one example. All the psychological theories as another, that are explained with the principles. Alignment with the principles gives us something we can count on to help us in life and in coaching. Wow. So how do we know when we're in alignment with the principles? We actually have a feeling of peace. So here we are. I love this illustration, the peace lily, because even though it is a revolution in nursing that is beginning, it is a very peaceful revolution. Because when we find peace within ourselves, we will be bringing peace to the world. That's how it works. So nurses worldwide are engaging in a revolutionary act that will change nursing and healthcare forever. What we actually are now is internationally known thought leaders regarding the future of nursing globally. That's where we are now. This revolution comes from within, and the realization that our thinking creates our reality. Who knew that it could be just that simple? Just those last two lines in the middle, the realization that our thinking creates our reality. That is the revolution. That is the insight which will change the practice of nursing forever. And human resilience is the most important part of our survival as a species. When I first was speaking about the principles, I always simply described them as the principles of health, because I see that that is what health is at its most basic level. I love that word, health. Resilience has, of course, become much more popular in recent times, and I like that wording. It suits our times very well. So in summary, the principles bring a simplicity that was not seen previously. It allows us to see the world in a new light. And as such, new questions and new answers appear. So this is the next level of certification. Where will it take you? Well, that felt like a whirlwind tour. The 40 years of exploration into human principles and into and regarding resilience in 50 minutes or less. Well, Teresa, I'll just begin with you. What might you like to have expanded on?
I think you hit all the topics. You know, I think and words just don't hold it. It's one of those we do the best that we can with the words that we have to describe it, but it truly is that feeling of you seeing principles in action in your own life. That's where it comes home. Lynn said that, you know, one of the slides says that we teach through logic, but it's experienced as insight. We've all experienced ourselves thinking. That's not new. But seeing your thoughts creating your reality, that's a little bit new. And because I thought I understood that too. Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm getting what I'm thinking in my life. But what I didn't know was that part of habits, like the way that I was raised. I was raised in a family of worriers. The more you worry about someone, the more you love them. Well, that was detrimental to my health. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that that wasn't true. And so when I came to a point in my life where, you know, nursing was getting kind of hard, I was tired, had a couple of family problems, and I was worried about that. And the more I worried, the sicker I got. I started going to doctors and, you know, having tests and blood work, and nothing came up. You know, so what was the problem here? And the very first time I saw myself as the thinker of all of the reality of my life and knew that everyone else in the world was doing the exact same thing as me, and that I couldn't possibly be responsible or know what another human being is thinking or feeling, I was able to drop the extra thinking. And the minute that happened, like this lightness, this energy that flowed through my body, out my hands and feet, was just like the relief was palpable. Like I could feel it release from me. That was a completely different experience. My body healed from pain in that moment, because stress and worry and busy-mindedness are heavy. Our bodies aren't separate from our thinking. They're not separate from our chemicals in our body. Stress chemicals are real. Oxytocin and the good feeling hormones are real. We feel those, but they come to us through thought. So everything that we experience in our life comes through us, mind, consciousness, and thought, the whole package, inseparable from our thinking and our body and our world that we see. I never saw it like that before. It was a completely different experience to notice how much my thinking had to do with my experience of life, and that I actually did have a choice. I didn't have to pay attention to all of the negative thinking and all of the worry, because the people in my life were perfectly capable of experiencing life through their thoughts. They're responsible for the way their life is. That's the way it works. That doesn't mean you don't love someone any less. In fact, I felt like there was a bigger part of me that could love them even more, while at the same time loving myself.
It's not something that we're asking anyone to believe. It's something that you can take and experiment with. You can see if it works. Does life really work in this way? Put it to the test. The proof is in the pudding. This is how we find out. We put it to the test.
No, the beauty of what these principles bring to us are the simplicity of it. If we can stop listening to the words and hear the meaning behind the words, that's the insight. It's familiar because we all do it. I mean, this is how we've always worked. But the simplicity is we're always living in the feeling of our thinking. Always. Yeah, I just appreciate everyone being here and listening and joining in the revolution.
Yeah, I found my article, and I was noticing the last sentence is that we have the largest task ever before humanity. Is it any wonder then that it will fall to the world's largest health profession? So that is what we are about. If we are to reshape health and wellness in the 21st century, let it bring all of nursing into holism, starting today. I just can't thank you, all of you, enough for being brave to even step into something as little known as what we've talked about here tonight. The American Nurses Association has their definition of what brings resilience. We have a completely different viewpoint, which is that we all are naturally resilient, and that our process now is simply to reveal that to ourselves through our own insight. So it's quite opposite of the way that things are being taught currently. But there have been some studies done through Baylor University Department of Statistics showing that nurses increase in resilience with each course that they take in nurse coaching. So that is evidence-based now, and we're thrilled for those outcomes.